of the moment. My name is Bobby Ghosh. I am your host from New York City. And this morning I'm delighted to be joined from Washington, D.C. by my friend and colleague, Andreas Kluth. Good morning, Andreas.
Morning, Bobby.
And about what has been the buzz of Washington for now nearly a month, maybe longer, the prospect of a tripartite agreement, maybe even, between the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, which will, depending on who you listen to, be peace in our time in the Middle East, or peace forever and ever in the Middle East, or nothing burger, depending on who you ask. Andreas wrote a terrific column about this late last week, which as soon as this conversation, I recommend you go read. Um, but Andreas, if you could set the table for us, what are the three parties expecting from a deal?
Well, there are three parties, and then possibly a fourth, maybe that we mentioned later, which is Iran. But the three
Yes.
parties, what they're expecting is, let's start with to the U.S. Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, recently flew to the region to Saudi Arabia to propose this stunning new deal, and for the U.S. It would entail Saudi Arabia normalizing relations with Israel, making peace, as other Arab countries have done in the Abraham Accords and accords before that. It in return for American security guarantees, in return for American help with civilian nuclear energy technology, and more. What so you can already see Saudi Arabia would get a lot.
Mm-hmm.
America, what would America gain? And will Israel has to be looped in. In return, America would get from Saudi Arabia essentially agreement not to keep flirting with the Chinese, with Beijing, uh, but to keep dealing with the Americans mainly. And of course, it would create stability between Saudi Arabia and then probably other Arab countries and Israel. What would Israel gain? A lot. I mean, normalization with the richest Arab nation and one of the most powerful. And that would probably unlock normalization with all the others as well. Uh, in Israel would have to, the Saudi Arabians would want something from Israel. They could probably settle for. We can discuss why I'm saying that. A gesture by Israel. I'm still making it sound easy. All of this is
No, of
insanely
course.
complicated, but a gesture by Israel to keep the two-state solution between Israel and Palestine alive, which means to limit settlements in the occupied territories. So if each side sort of agrees to these huge things, they would also each get something, and that would completely change the landscape, the strategic landscape in the Middle East, because there's another country, Iran, nearby, and then of course Turkey and Russia and all of that, and China in the wings. That's in theory how the gist of the deal that Jake Sullivan on behalf of Joe Biden proposed.
So let's get into the weeds of some of it. Saying what what the Saudis want is a security guarantee from the United States. What does that mean? What is a security guarantee?
Well,
Context.
that's the so from the scuttlebutt in this town, uh, it would be less than the Article 5 guarantee that NATO members give each other, where
Mm-hmm.
an attack, if they're attacked, we immediately come to the country's aid. But it still would be a lot. Um, I mean, for Saudi Arabia, that would be great. In addition, it would also get American weapons again. Joe Biden, this is a turnaround for America, because Joe Biden initially, in the first part of his administration, wanted to distance himself from Saudi Arabia
Yeah.
for human rights and other reasons, and also because American weapons, the Saudis were using them in the proxy war in Yemen, so they stopped sending the important weapons. Saudi Arabia would get that again. So for Saudi Arabia, it would get a security guarantee and American weapons and nuclear power generation technology. which could, of course, that's the idea is that it should never be, but used one day to go the extra step to a nuclear bomb. So the
Right.
Saudis would get a lot, but they would have to give up something, which is their hard power approach to trial of in recent this year basically triangulating between China and America to say, hey,
Is
look,
that?
I mean,
Go ahead.
no, I think you could see that Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, has played his cards very well. Ruthless realist, of course, not just ruthless and also a realist, but realized that this American anxiety about the large standoff with China, and so he talked to the Chinese for a while, but earlier this year, and allowed the Chinese to broker a detente, a rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, these arch enemies who are now closer again because of the Chinese. And I think at that point, the Americans realized, oh, what if the Chinese displace us in that region, which is an important region, as the hegemon? We can't let that happen. We have to offer them something, even though up to now we've not been talking to the Saudis. I mean, I think, that's how it really came about, or how the urgency of this came about.
Now, a lot of people listening to us will wonder, wait, don't we already essentially a security guarantee with the South? After all, and this goes back decades, we have
Right.
essentially guaranteed the House of Saud as rulers of that country. When Saudi Arabia was threatened, the last time that happened in any meaning was when Iraq invaded Kuwait. The United States not only put, basically almost international coalition in the Saudis, as well as to eject the Iraqis from Kuwait. We've been selling them arms. I mean, yes, there was a brief. We've been selling them arms. There are lots of intelligence with the Saudis. I mean, it looks like a security arrangement, a guarantee. It smells like a security guarantee. What else would be required for it to be a guarantee?
Well, this is where I'm glad to be talking to you because you're one of the experts that I bow to on this subject. Longtime Middle East expert, Bobby Ghosh. But you just outlined it, so keep going because actually it would be a question I want to put back to you. The one thing I'll say, because we haven't talked about Israel or Iran yet, but as far as this U.S. Saudi arrangement, it would be, I think you would agree with that, to go from a de facto to a de jure relationship. And that's not
Yeah.
an insignificant step. So there's
Yeah.
been a de facto and an implied guarantee, you might say. That's what he just said, I think. And it would become a de jure guarantee with an explicit security guarantee
Something
and
written
weapons
down.
again.
Right.
Right. And the nuclear energy help
Yes.
added. And it would be even if you think the step would just be small, and I want to hear that from you, it would still be very controversial in this town, and not just in this town, because it would be, as Tom Friedman just said to me on Friday, I think it would be the first de jure security guarantee America has offered to a non-democracy.
Yes, and not just a non-democracy, a democracy that, a ruler who's problematic and not exactly beloved in Washington. Line of other dictators lining up for deals like that. Um, there's also the question of whether in Saudi Arabia, I mean, Saudis, it's not a democracy. He doesn't have to win elections, but he does have to keep an eye out on public impressions. And a deal with the Americans, I don't know that will necessarily be universally popular in Saudi Arabia, but we'll see. I mean, one thing I don't think they're going to give up is additional basing rights. I'm not clear that the United States actually needs that, but often that can be the sort of the crowning glory, if you like, of a security arrangement but I don't think that would be on offer. The Saudis are have always jealously guarded their position as the custodians of the holy sites of Islam and having foreign military boots on the ground, although they have allowed it in the past with a wink and a nod, to do it de jure, as you say, would be very problematic.
Well, let me ask you
Yeah,
before
go
we
ahead.
move on,
Yeah.
to Israel and the US, but because this is the thing I think we're talking about, will it happen, won't it happen, and if it doesn't happen, why wouldn't it? But from your analysis just now, guardians of Mecca and Medina, custodians of the Palestinians in a way or something, my impression is that it is that MBS does not have to worry about popular opinion too much, and that was the point of my article: is that power trumps values, and that he's just posing to stick up for the Palestinians anyway. So my question is, do you think in the end they would gain more than they lose from, I mean, MBS, and will do the deal? That's what it'll come down to. Or do you think the domestic unpopularity is a block and would block progress?
Well, I'm skeptical for reasons, which is not to say it won't happen. I've been skeptical about things that have happened anyway. One is that, yes, you're right. He doesn't have to worry about popular opinion, but he kind of does. Seems very clearly to care about it. He has made enormous effort to make himself popular with the Saudis. He does seem to value public opinion. He values opinion in Saudi Arabia, of course, but more widely across the Muslim world. So he'd have to be very careful about packaging this. The other part to that is that he does have one person's opinion above everything else, including arguably sometimes his own, which is his father, King Salman, who has been ailing for many years, and we constantly that he's not long for this world, but he's still there. And his son Mohammed may run the country, but he does bow to his father on a couple of things, and one of those things is the Palestine. King Salman is of a generation who genuinely cared about the Palestinians. He embraced the cause long before it became a sort of cynical tool employed against Israel and against the United States. And he has, we know this from lots of reporting, that he has said, over my dead body, will we normalize relations with Israel. So the received wisdom for a couple of years now has been that MBS will make a deal, but not while his in the picture. That's a very important consideration for to their publics. They're answerable. That relationship becomes vastly sort of amplified. I think that's something to keep in mind. But let's go now to the next part of that. What the U.S. wants from the Saudis, which is that with the Chinese, is that a realistic expectation? You pointed out that MBS is brutal and also a realist, and if he's a realist, he knows that China is his single biggest customer. Not now, but for a long time into the future, his single largest customer is going to be China. China is also the single largest customer of the country that represents the closest thing to an existential threat to the Saudis, which is Iran. And as Iran gradually expands its exports, this past year was the single largest exports from Iran of oil, and most of that went to China. The Saudis have to be very careful about how they treat the Chinese. I mean, if they back away from the Chinese, have not many, but some other options. Is it really to expect the Saudis to just say, "Oh, we'll just sell you oil and nothing else"?
You just made a perfect case that if you were testifying before the Senate, which has to ratify this business, why it might not go through from the American. This skepticism is exactly that. Is why would someone like MBS do this, given that he wants to play all sides, not just both sides, but all sides in this. And um, so, therefore, the Americans would have to insist on, because they're giving Saudi Arabia a lot, and Israel will be asked to give a lot. So, they will have to insist that Saudi Arabia gives a lot and that it's, as it were, observable and verifiable. And for instance, I mean that oil will never be invoiced in the yuan, that the Chinese won't get bases, this sort of stuff. And then of course then everyone knows it'll be open season forever for MBS to play at the edges. Of course, he's allowed to meet people, to talk, will will that work or not? And so this is the problem on the American side, is that skepticism that you just voiced, because we're gonna, bone saw, etc. The abbreviations for MBS.
Yes.
We're gonna get in bed with people that on the idealistic left, but also on the isolationist Republican right. We're giving security guarantees in that region. We're going to have to automatically go to war for these people. There are going to be people who are going to be against us, either
Yes.
rhetorically or actually,
And
and they're going to
bipartisan,
say
not just on one
exactly,
side of the aisle. Yeah.
and then they'll say, in return for them not be staying on our side and not on China's, you don't believe that yourself, and you
Yeah.
just made that case perfectly. So this is why this is not this deal will happen. Let's talk about it, what it means, but will this deal happen? And I think you just said it perfectly. He will want to play all sides, but mainly the two big Chinese and American sides, and that's something that's part of the puzzle that here in the White House down the street that they'll have to work out first.
Yeah, and it also, the other question mark is whether, I mean, the one thing that most Americans will easily understand, most folks, I assume, in Washington would welcome, is an agreement that protects the price of oil. That is the thing most about Saudi Arabia. I don't think that's the only reason they should, but that is the reason why, certainly in the political class, they care most about Saudi Arabia. And it hasn't been suggested for a moment that that might be part of the deal.
No, but I think all these things could enter the deal because, it's early days and it'll be during an election season next year in America that this happens. So who knows what gets thrown in? But, before we just run out of time, we should probably go to number three in the triangle, and even number four, the sort of that creates the weird shape that's quadrilateral, lateral, but Israel. So I'd be, of course, concerned. The thing that you could probably summarize better than me is the interest. What Israel would gain strategically is very obvious, because its biggest enemy in the region is Iran, and this would be a united front, or part of the process of making a united front against that. If the government and the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel, cared only about Israel's geopolitical interests, but there are other things that they care about. Netanyahu needs this far right coalition he's in. A lot of people say, with some echoes to this place here, to not get indicted or convicted in a court. And that coalition and himself, they want to do the exact opposite of the
That's
one
right.
thing that the Saudis and the Americans want from them. That's why I framed it in my column as values versus power. But of course, it's their own individual power. I could have said it like that. Will Bibi Netanyahu stay in power with that coalition or not? He might not, if they do what they're asked to do, which is to actually, I mean, if they could choose, they would have a one-state solution and they would annex the
Yes.
Palestinian territories, and they're being asked to do the opposite. So how would that fly? Would that coalition break apart? Should it maybe break apart? And we'll carry on with the next coalition. But that's just as big the wild card. The reason why it might not happen, I think, Israel's strategic interests would say you should do this deal.
Yeah.
I'd like to know if you agree.
Yes, I
And
do.
there, and Netanyahu's political calculation will say, no, I'm not doing this deal. And that is a tension that every country goes through. And that's why it's interesting, even if you're not interested in the Middle East, but you're listening, it's in Southeast Asia, everywhere, they have the same calculation. These clash head on. What do you think about that? How do you think it'll go?
Well, it's Netanyahu is an interesting. On the one hand, he's been surrounded by bad news since the moment he took office for the umpteenth time late last year. There've been months and months and months of protests against what he's trying to do, which is essentially capture the judicial system. He could use some sort of a success, to distract public opinion, even if that meant a somewhat tenuous deal. It could at least something to boast about, and he's had nothing to boast about. For a man who's so preternaturally boastful, that's quite difficult. He needs something to show, he needs something to thump his chest about. This might be it. But here's the thing, if you're the South, even if you're the Americans, Benjamin Netanyahu agrees to now, worth the paper it's signed off on. You say it's a highly volatile and uncertain coalition. The one certainty is that they all have the same attitude with little gradations, but they're essentially the same attitude to the Palestinians. And as you say, you're asking them to go against what they would consider their values. Also, there is a connection in that instance between their values and their power, because their power comes from those values. The fact that they won the last election on a platform or anti-Palestinian platform. And it's one thing to say, oh, well, we can wait for this coalition to fall and make a deal with the next coalition. But here's the thing. The next coalition, Netanyahu as prime minister. So the next coalition may not look that different from this one. It's really interesting to be addressed that you have potentially three people who will sign off on this deal. Two out of the three, Biden and Netanyahu, cannot be relied upon to actually bring this plane onto the tarmac. I mean, both of them face so many different and complex political nations at home. Neither of them might be able to on anything they promise, and the Saudis know this.
That's one thing, and just to make it even simpler and more, I framed my column as Thucydides and realism versus Woodrow Wilson and idealism. And the three people that'll be signing it or will agree to it. Also, just it's obvious they cannot stand each other. They're disgusted by one another for all reasons, some good, some bad. But this is sort of the least likely. And of course, that's in realism. That's what diplomacy is for. They're going to do this. And that would be a triumph of realism over idealism, of power over values, of hard mathematical power calculations. Yeah. That's why this is so interesting, I think, for people like you and me to observe how this will play out. And I was just going to say, this coalition under Netanyahu is probably the hardest to agree to this deal, wouldn't you say? Any other coalition is more likely to agree. So if it cracks apart and another one forms, that wouldn't necessarily hurt the deal. Would you say that?
Possibly. The thing with Israeli politics is that to predict anything is a mug's game, and so many people, including myself, have been proved horrible. This could have fallen, another coalition would have come on board. It would have to have some elements of the right. Its survival would depend on some elements of the right, and it could fall on a deal like this. Before we move,
I want to ask you something, Bobby.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I wanted to ask you about the fourth leg.
Yes. But before we go there, one last question, one last thought. Because you are such a student of history and your columns are so often shot through with your historical perspective, I'm struggling to tripartite deal anywhere important in the history of in modern history where all three parties have hated each other this much. I mean, you think of the Carter White House photo with the Israel and Palestine, at least the American leadership and the Israeli leadership liked and trusted each other. You think of the Second World War, Churchill and Roosevelt liked each other. They may not have started. I can't think of a single example where all three parties disliked and distrusted each other this much.
No, you're right, and as you say it does occur to me. So the Yalta conference, so we say two hated the third, and the third hated the other two, and then you give other examples. I have to check. I mean, at the Congress of Vienna after the Napoleonic Wars, I think in those days they all hated everyone else, and but not in this visceral way, and there was no ideology in play. I mean, you kind of go to Game of Thrones, right? To this, where everyone
Yeah.
hates everyone, and
Yeah.
that is sort of the analogy to the region, where it is true. Like you can get the friend of my friend, brother of my brother, that famous Middle Eastern saying,
Yes.
but that's where the fourth actor, Iran, comes in. Is like you have to not China, America, for instance, had decided not to hate, but to be worried about China more than these other issues. In Russia, we haven't mentioned, and Turkey, we haven't mentioned. But then I think all the people involved, they hate each other. We agree, but they hate this one agent more than each other,
Yeah.
and that is Iran at the moment. And that's and I was going to ask you, because the Iranians are watching this, and they're just very recently, they're doing these. Um, I wonder if these are signals of them responding to this by transferring, I think, 4 American citizens from prison to house arrest in possible preparation for a deal with the America to unfreeze Iranian funds. And possibly there was a headline saying, hey, this is separate from, but this could be extended to talking about the nuclear pact again. And so maybe if the Iranians see these former enemies are no longer enemies, but actually sort of tenuous allies, this is not good for us, and we need to change course. And I wonder if, and that would be a very good outcome. But I wonder if you think that's how they would react, if I'm reading that right.
It's always hard to read the tea leaves because that regime is so opaque, and there are people who sometimes presume to speak for the regime, or is essentially presume to speak for one man, which is Supreme Leader Khamenei, and then it turns out that they're not really authorized to, or sometimes he deliberately allows them to speak to set up trial balloons only to puncture convenient. So it's a little hard to know. I know that the hostage release has been in the works for many months. There have been conversations going back, and with the interjection of the Qataris, and it's mostly to do with money. It's for cash, kidnap and ransom, essentially. The timing is, and it may be that the Iranians are, they're certainly paying attention, and this may be another little balloon they're floating up. I'm very skeptical that on the nuclear program as they have it. It is very, in their mind, I don't believe this is true, but in their mind, it's an existential situation. They are quite hard about some aspects of their regional policy. They don't see the Saudis as a threat at all, as a military threat, not at all. They have demonstrated in Yemen using their proxies, the Houthis, that the Saudi military force isn't what the paper it's written on. That it's kind of, they to police the Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade. They got really badly mauled by a group of poorly armed but highly motivated Iran-backed rebels in Yemen. This is not a military threat. The military threat to the Iranians, from their perspective, comes from the United States and Israel, and that alliance has always been, in their mind, sort of basically cast in stone, that the two cannot be separated. So I don't think that guarantees will change the calculus for the Saudis. Um, but it would for the Iranians, I'm sorry, but
Iranians.
it would certainly be that they have to calculate as they sort of draw up a map of their map of threats and opportunities in the Middle East. Sorry.
And I think that already is part of why Joe Biden, Jake Sullivan, and why the White House, why they want to do this. They want to keep Russia down, keep China out, and keep Iranians guessing. I mean, that would be enough, I would think, if you're Henry Kissinger looking at this, to say what this is worth a try. I think it's worth a try. I just want to say again, I think the rest of the world will be watching this, and it's just so interesting because it does. We haven't sort of made this explicit, but for Joe Biden, it is such an incredible U-turn in that when he came in and I mean he's been thinking about foreign affairs his entire long career, but he came in and the notes he struck were more idealistic, almost Wilsonian. So he until recently he's tried to rally the world against Russia and China by saying it's democracies versus autocracies. And then he noticed that that's not working because the global south isn't buying it. And because India is sort of a backsliding democracy, quasi autocracy increasingly, and that's not working. And he specifically wanted to avoid and shun and turn Saudi Arabia into a pariah or MBS specifically because of atrocities in Yemen, because of the specific atrocity with the journalist that was killed. And they decided no, too much has changed. Number one, China, even before the Russian invasion, and now after the Russian invasion, where Iran is supplying the Russians with drones that are killing Ukrainians, everything has changed. And this turn is a general turn from idealism to realism. At some point in the future, it'll turn back, but right now, that's what it is. And I think they will apply that same logic in Southeast Asia, in East Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, and everywhere. I think that's the way they think about the world now, and I think that's why it's interesting for everyone in the world watching this. I think the Biden administration has done this turn. I lost your audio, Bobby.
Well, and as I was saying, now that you've moved from Berlin to Washington, you to watch the evolution of the thinking behind Biden's foreign policy, and there'll be many more columns to come from you on this topic that our readers and myself will greatly enjoy. Thank you so much, Andreas, for joining me this morning.
Thank you, Bobby, as always.
Thank you to all our listeners and viewers for joining us as well. As you know by now, we do these conversations from Bloomberg Opinion almost every day. Follow us on Twitter or X. At Opinion is our handle to find out about these live stream conversations in the days ahead. Also look for our Andreas's this particular column, but all his terrific writing on foreign policy, and all of our many colleagues all over the world covering a wide range of topics at bloomberg.com/opinion. And I hope to see you next Monday for the next one. Thank you very much. Goodbye.